Now we are down to the last lesson on choosing the right test, because that is the usual dilemma of researchers and statisticians, that is to choose the appropriate statistical test. Okay, so this section discusses one of the most common questions that usually plague most of the students. What statistical test should I use? So there are several steps to help you decide on what statistical test to use. Okay, so you have to remember that there are things that you need to consider in choosing the right test. Number one is uh, the research objectives. Okay, so again, choosing the right test would have to take a look at the basics of the research, and that is the research question, because it would tell how are you going to address that question through the use of the appropriate statistical test. Also, you have to take note that one way of choosing the right test is also to look at the dependent variable and what type of variable is it. And if there are independent variables, how many and what are their types? And also, are you interested in comparing means or investigating relationships? And do you have repeated measurements of the same variable for each subject? Also, you have to take note of the design. So there is one also that is important to be considered, is the research design. So in looking at the research question, we have to be clear on the type of questions and what are the measurable quantities. That is why some others would write the verifiable characteristics. And which value of variables will help answer these questions. Okay, so that's one thing. The answering, or what type of variables will answer these research questions. And also, you have to think about what test is needed before carrying out a study so that the right type of variables are collected. That is why in research, it is very important that the statistician has to be part of the panel, because the statistician will help the researcher formulate the or advise the researcher the right statistical test that will be carried out in order for him to answer the objectives of the study properly. Then we have dependent variables. So you have to explain also that you have to distinguish between what are these dependent and independent variables. So independent, these are explanatory variables, while the dependent, these are the outcome variables. Okay, so regarding of the research question, so the explanatory variables are thought to have an effect on the dependent variable, and the distinction between the two is important when you carry out your stats analysis. So for example, if you were investigating the relationship between attendance to the exam score, the independent variable is the attendance, while the dependent variable is the exam score. Or if you are investigating whether women carry out more housework than men, so we would say that gender is independent and housework is the dependent. So types of variables that you're going to look into, do you have your dependent, whether that is a scale or categorical, and whether if it's categorical is ordinal or nominal. So are boys better at maths? How can better be measured? Better be measured, and what type of variable is it? So you will look at the exam score to determine whether boys are better than girls at maths. So you have the exam score, and that is a scale variable, scale data. Do boys think they are better at maths? Okay, so I consider myself to be good at math, and that answer is ordinal. So how many variables are involved? So you have two interested in the relationship. So one dependent and one independent. So the dependent and the several independent variables, some may be controls. So here, if we're looking at how many variables are needed for each question, research question, one sample test are really asked about. So the most common tests involved one independent and one dependent, or one dependent and several independent, which some of which may be control variables, that is age and gender. So if there are several respondents dependent variables, we have to clarify if the relationship between them is of interest or whether they are investigated separately. So if we can use multivariate techniques if it involves several dependent variables and should only be used by competent students. If you are confident enough to use multivariate techniques, then you can use that. Then your data types. Okay, so remember you have your research question, whether that is you're talking about dependent outcome variables or independent explanatory variables. So does attendance have an association with exam score? Your dependent is the exam score and your independent is the attendance. Do women do more houseworks than men? So the dependent, these are the hours of housework per week done by women and men. And then the independent is the gender. So let us have this exercise. How would you investigate the following topics, and you state the dependent and independent variables and their variable types? Okay, so were Americans more likely to survive on board the Titanic? Okay. Survival is binary. Survive, died. And the independent there is the nationality. Okay, so we're Americans, so nationality. Does weekly hours of work influence the amount of time spent on housework? So your dependent is the hours of housework, and the independent, these are the hours of work. So that is also a scale. And which of the three diets is best for losing weight? So the dependent is the weight lost on diet. So that is a scale. While the independent variable is the diets. The diets 1, 2, 3, and that is nominal. Okay, and when it comes to comparing means, you have to take note if your dependent is a scale and your independent is categorical. So how many means are you comparing? So again, when you compare means, your independent variable is categorical and your dependent is scale. So for example, gender and academic performance. So your independent is gender and your dependent is academic performance. So how many means are you comparing, whether it's 2 or 3? So do you have independent groups or repeated measurements on each person? So here, if you're comparing means on the same people, okay, so although this is also known as repeated measures, okay, so it can be used to look at differences in mean score over 2 or more time points. That is the example that we have on 1988 versus 2014. And under 2 or more conditions, that is on the taste score. So participants are asked to taste 2 types of cola and give each scores of 100. So here, the dependent is the taste score based on the hedonic scale, and the independent, which is the type of COLA. So when comparing repeated measures of the same people, this could be the same variable at different time points or under different conditions. So for example, that's the one I told you already, that if you are going to be asked to rate two types of cola, they try both and give each a score. So the same person scores both drinks. Repeated measures comparisons are sometimes referred to as within group comparisons, whereas comparisons of independent groups can also be called between group comparisons. And that is the analysis of variance. When you're comparing between groups, if you have two groups, you will use independent t-test. If you have three or more, you use one-way ANOVA. If you're comparing measurement within the subject, that's a paired t-test if you have two groups. And it will be a repeated measures ANOVA if it is three groups or more. And if we have this, okay, so do women do more housework than men? So housework is your dependent, that's in terms of hours. The independent is the gender, that's nominal. So we are going to use the test statistic, which is independent t-test. Does margarine, eggs reduce cholesterol? Everyone has cholesterol measured on 3 occasions. So cholesterol is measured that is a scale variable, and its independent variable is the occasion. There are 3 occasions, so that's nominal. So the test statistic is the repeated measures ANOVA. Which of 3 diets is best for losing weight? So its dependent is the weight lost, and that is a scale. And the independent is the diet program. That's 1, 2, 3. And what you're going to do to use the test statistic that you will be using is the one-way ANOVA. If you are investigating relationships, okay, so if you have two categorical variables and your dependent is categorical while your independent is also categorical, then you use chi-square test. You have two scale variables, both dependent and both independent, then that's the time that you will use Pearson's correlation. If you are going to predict the value of a dependent variable from a value of an independent variable, then you use that your dependent variable is binary, your independent is a scale or that's binary, and that's the time you're going to use logistic regression. Okay, so another set of examples. So you have, does attendance affect exam scores? So your dependent is the exam score and your independent variables is the attendance. So you can use correlation or regression. But when your independent is going to be binary, attended, not attended, that's going to be categorical. So that's the time that you're going to use an independent t-test. Do women do more housework than men? So your dependent is the housework that's measured in hours per week, that's scale. And independent variables is binary, that's gender. And you're going to use, and also these are the hours worked also, so you're going to use regression. But in another question, you have, were Americans more likely to survive on board Titanic? So you have survival as binary. And if you only have one independent variable, which is nationality, that is chi-squared. But if you have two independent variables, three, nationality, gender, and class, and that's the time you will use logistic regression. Okay, so please take note that there may be two appropriate tests for some questions.